So with that, let me go ahead and I'm going to stop sharing and pass it on to Skye.
Great. Thank you so much. And I am going to start sharing. I do have a few slides together and I'll share these out because there's a couple of links that are in there. And then I've also got some links open across the top. So thank you all so much for having me here. It is such a pleasure. And I always love talking about nonprofits on Salesforce. So as mentioned, my name is Skye Tyler. I'm a senior consultant at Exponent Partners. Just making sure, can everybody see the intro slide? Okay, making sure I'm sharing the right screen. I've been working with nonprofits on Salesforce for almost 7 years now. I had some prior sysadmin experience as well as working with and volunteering with nonprofits in previous lives. But when I found the Salesforce nonprofit space, I feel like I found my people because I can get super nerdy and technical, but also still feel like I'm making a difference in the world and helping organizations to better meet their missions. So for today, we're going to be talking about preparing for and getting ready to hopefully pass your nonprofit cloud consultant exam. The agenda, very simply, we're going to talk about the exam guide. So I'm sure, I know some of you had talked about either recently or recently getting certified or preparing for certifications. So we're also going to talk about sort of the importance of industry knowledge when it comes to any of the consultant level certifications. And then just some test taking tips. I have a few of my tips in here, but I would think this is a really great opportunity to open it up for everyone to contribute on what's worked well for them, how they help prepare, because honestly, we all learn better together. So jumping right in, for the exam guide, I've got the link in here. If you're not already familiar with on Trailhead, you can get to all of the certification pages on the Trailhead certification section, and then go into the actual exam guide. And I have to say, when I looked at my first exam guide back in like 2018, I think it was, they've come a long way. The exam guides have really improved with breaking down and talking about the different sections of it. And then also Trailhead and several people within the community have done a fantastic job of putting together trail mixes to help prepare for certifications. So I'm going to be linking mostly to like Salesforce official type things, but there are also other options and other resources to reach out to. Feel free to share those in the chat with the rest of the folks on the call if you found something that's worked really well for you. But a couple of things to highlight. When you're looking at any of the exams, there's always going to be the sections of the exam, what the exam is intended to cover, and it's going to be broken out by percentages. One of the things that folks really struggle with is where do I put my focus? Where do I spend the most time studying or practicing? And some of that's really going to depend on your prior experience. But a good rule of thumb is if it's 20% or more of the exam, spend a good chunk of your time studying that topic. Most of the exams only have 60 questions. Some of them will have 65 and 5 of them are not scored, but you never know which 5 it is. So if you think about an exam and about 20% of that exam, if you can feel really confident in the material that's addressed in a section of the exam weighted at 20% or more, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to pass that exam. Also, when we're talking about passing, the exam guide will tell you what the pass-fail rate is for an exam. And one of the things that my dad told me when I was in college years and years ago, and I would get very stressed out about trying to get all A's in college. Do you know, this is what my dad asked me, he said, do you know what they call a medical student who got a C? Does anybody know the answer? Charlie's nodding.
Doctor.
Doctor.
Yeah, they still call him doctor. So don't beat yourself up. Don't feel like you're not ready to take the exam until you know 100% of all the material. Salesforce gets upgrades 3 times a year. Industry policies and practices change all the time. It's virtually impossible to know everything. So get yourself to the point where you feel comfortable and confident enough to take the exam. Take it. If you pass on the first try, congratulations, celebrate, confetti, all the things. If you don't pass on the first try, also congratulations, because you've taken one step more than a whole bunch of people who are too afraid to make that first attempt. And after you take the exam, whether you pass or not, you get a breakdown that's weighted by these sections. that shows you the percentage of what you accomplished on each of those sections. So you are now one step closer to passing again, because you know where to put your time and energy to brush up on the things that were maybe not as strong for you. So before we move on, I want to take just a moment and see if anybody has any questions, comments, feedback on the use of the exam guide and the section weightings of that. All right, I see a couple of heads shaking, so we'll go ahead and continue on. I do want to go ahead and open up the exam guide just in case anybody hasn't had a chance to take a look at it yet. And this is where I was talking about that they've really improved just the resources that are available within the Trailhead section. So being able to talk about, for instance, the purpose of the exam guide. So this is where you can find out things like what the pass rate is. With any of the Salesforce exams, whether you're taking them in person or not, you are not allowed to take many materials. So, you know, Cliff Notes or resource books or guides or printed materials, but any other information that's pertinent about the exam will be here. It's really helpful to just take a look there and make sure that you understand what the pass-fail rate is. It does vary by exam, and that again can help you with understanding what your comfort level is with each of the sections. Recommended training. So there is always a recommended trail mix that the Trailhead team puts together. And so I strongly encourage you, even if you're already working in a nonprofit, even if you've been in nonprofit space for a while, if you are preparing to take the Nonprofit Cloud Consultant exam, complete the entire trail mix. And the reason I say that is before these trail mixes, it was like fun guys like John who just put together his own trail mix that was like, here's stuff that I think would be helpful based on what was listed in the exam guide. But the Trailhead official trail mix is much more robust, and it oftentimes includes additional links to like white papers or articles, Salesforce blog posts. So much more than just a trail mix of actual modules to put together. And also Salesforce Trailhead keeps this up to date. So as new content or new information is included, as an exam is updated, the trail mix also gets updated to reflect new content and information. So always go through the entire trail mix. And if you say like, holy cow, this is like 14,000 points and all these different trails, this is going to take me forever. It really doesn't take that long, but honestly, the time's going to pass anyway. So why not spend it learning something new and feeling a little bit more prepared for your exam? I do have this other trail mix from my friend John that I'm sharing with the group as well. So John works in salesforce.org. I can never remember people's titles, but he does something very cool there. But he put this together as a useful resource for the community, just in general, putting it together to learn about consulting for nonprofits, primarily for the partner community. And so if you're looking at getting into consulting, unless you're going to be an independent consultancy, your consultancy would probably be in some way affiliated with the Salesforce Partner Program. But it's another great resource. There is going to be some overlap between the Salesforce official Trailhead trail mix and John's trail mix. But I also found some of the information in here was just really, really helpful. And you can never learn too much. Before we move on again, any questions about trail mixes? All right. One of the things to note is when you go through the sections in the Trailhead exam guide, it is going to break out these different areas for you. So when you do the expand, it's going to give you like what each of those sections means. But you'll notice that some of these are pretty small, right? It's not like going into a whole lot of deep detail. And so I encourage you to do your own sort of study guide. So if you're looking at something like identify the appropriate solutions for fundraising and donor management, fully confess, I'm a bit of a nerd. So I would take each of these bullet points, pop them out into a Google Sheet or Word doc or whatever platform you use. And I would go ahead and try to answer these as if they were questions. So saying, what are a couple of appropriate solutions? All right, well, I'm going to list things like NPSP using automation, maybe looking at third-party apps like Classy that integrate for online donation collection. Depending on when I'm preparing for the exam, maybe even looking at Salesforce payments, if that's going to be an option to be able to process payments directly within Salesforce without using a third-party payment processor. So trying to go through and answer each of those, and I can tell you right now, it's going to be a lot easier to come up with possible answers for these types of questions after you've done the trail mixes, because the trail mixes are going to cover all of the content that is broken out in each of these sections. All right, I feel like y'all are taking it real easy on me. I should have put a quiz at the end just to make sure everyone's paying attention. All right, so I'm going to talk really quickly about industry knowledge. This is the one that for people who are trying to get into the nonprofit space or into nonprofit consulting space, this is probably the trickiest one to master. And I want to talk just for a moment about the difference between Salesforce admin, advanced admin app builder exam and any of the consultancy exams. When you're thinking about a Salesforce admin, advanced admin, or app builder, you're talking about core program functionality. And this is, in my opinion, sort of more of like book learning and technical application, right? So it's going to be a lot more focused on the specifics of the functionality. So things like security settings, how do roles and profiles and permission sets all play together? When you're thinking about consulting exams though, and this even includes Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, Education Cloud, Marketing Cloud, all of the cloud consultant exams, there's going to be a heavy focus on industry knowledge. And the reason that this is important is that every industry has its own language or terminology, and they have their own processes. And the best way that I can illustrate this is using opportunities. So the opportunity object comes out of just the base Salesforce sales functionality, but it's been repurposed in the Nonprofit Success Pack for processing and managing things like donations. Understanding the difference in how a for-profit business builds and manages its pipeline. Yes, technically there are similarities across the two, but the business processes, the language, the terminology, and even some of the intent of how a nonprofit cultivates their donor management is very different. So it still uses the same base features, functionalities, objects, fields, maybe even some of the same automation, but the thought process behind it can be very different. And having worked with some consultants that came from the for-profit world and had really deep Salesforce experience, but only maybe like tangentially related to nonprofit experience, this is one of the hardest things, because you think like, well, this is how we did our territories and this is how we did our forecasting. And not to say that nonprofits don't need to make money, because they need to still pay their bills and pay their salaries, but it's just a very different focus. And I'd like to just pause for a moment, because I know we've got a lot of folks who work in nonprofits or work with nonprofits. And I'd like to give anyone here an opportunity to come off mute and or come on video and share anything that may have been either surprising to them when they came into the nonprofit world, or if you've been in it long enough that you forgot the things that were surprising, the things for you that other people find hard to understand or grasp about the nonprofit space.
I can chip in a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes the decision-making processes can be different in a nonprofit, because they are, maybe it's because nonprofits haven't lived with data for quite as long as maybe for-profit or other types of enterprises. But it seems like, sometimes that just changes the amount of time takes to make decisions, the manner in which decisions are made, things like that.
That's a great example. And I like that thought that they haven't really lived with data as long, because I think a lot of nonprofits are used to collecting data, but primarily geared towards reporting for grants and funding, as opposed to, being really intentional about how to use that for things like strategic planning or program planning.
Just to piggyback off of what both of you have said, my experience with my nonprofit, we implemented Salesforce. We hired a team to build it out for us specifically to our needs, and ultimately realized that we didn't understand how our programs ran, how our departments functioned, and trying to get everything nailed down to then represent in Salesforce was incredibly challenging. And we did it wrong in a lot of situations. So there's a lot of cleanup and things we learned now that we wish we had known then.
I wish that were not true, Amber, for more nonprofits. And I think really that's one of the biggest benefits of having consultancies, or consultancies that focus on nonprofits, or consultancies that have a specific nonprofit department or division, is when you think about things kind of tying the two together, right? Businesses usually have a very well-defined organizational structure and management plan, business processes outlined, even departmental silos. Department A does this and B does this before C can do that. And I think nonprofits were kind of agile before agile was a thing, but not in quite the same way, where they'd say, hey, we're going to try something and we're going to iterate over it and try it again and iterate over it, try it again. But some of that documentation isn't there, and the consistency across can really fall apart a little bit. And this department keeps doing things this way, and this department does things their own way. And to be able to have a consultancy that comes in and is able to help you define that before you start building it out in Salesforce is just, I think, a really helpful process.
One thing I'd like to jump in and say is that it's really helpful for consultants to focus on budget and to really understand that as a nonprofit, that you really figure out your budget, maybe once a year and what you have for the fiscal year, and that's it. Whereas it's a lot different, for a for-profit than just, I have this lump sum that I can devote to this program and that's it.
Yeah, good point, Laura. I see Ruby's iPad has a question or has something to contribute.
I actually have a question because what I'm going to be, I'm working with my husband's nonprofit to set him up on Salesforce. And I was thinking of using the campaigns functionality because he conducts classes for inmates who are transitioning from prison to the community. And so wanted to keep track of all of the course enrollments, all the clients who are going through the classes, and then organizing that maybe by cohort. Do you think that campaigns would be a good way of tracking that, or is there some other way that might be more beneficial?
That's a really great question. Thank you for bringing that up. I would be hesitant to use campaigns for what you're describing, because I think you're ultimately going to want to track a lot more than just who was in the same cohort and what sessions did they attend. I would encourage you to look at the recently released and still at the moment free program management module that sits on top of NPSP, that sits on top of Salesforce. So it's the PMM, or program management module, and the nonprofit cloud case management are two of Salesforce.org's newer offerings. Nonprofit cloud case management is a paid service, paid licenses that sits on top, but it also uses some of the PMM objects. I would encourage you to take a look at that. And there's some documentation on it. If you are in a nonprofit or working for a nonprofit, if you didn't already know about the Power of Us Hub, it's great until they move it. And I think I can't remember if they moved it already or if they're in the process of moving it over to the full Trailblazer community. But for those of us who know and love the Power of Us Hub, the hub is getting reimagined. So stay tuned. I don't know if that happened before Dreamforce yet. But there's additional documentation and resources in there as well. And I would encourage you to take a look at that, because one of the things that I see happen a lot with nonprofits is they look at the tool that can manage what they need today and end up kind of boxing themselves in for growing in the future. And that would be my primary hesitation with recommending using campaigns for a feature like what you described.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Great. All right, before we move on, one of the biggest things that I found to be sort of a disparity between for-profits and nonprofits, every nonprofit I've worked with is 100% convinced that their fundraising and donation management process is completely unique and that nobody else asks for money the way that they do. And it amazed me because coming from for-profit and government as previous employers, for-profit is totally happy to steal ideas from other people if something worked well and run with it. So even just kind of keeping that idea in mind of the willingness to be able to look at how other organizations do things and see what you can leverage. I feel like a lot of times nonprofits feel so focused on their mission, which is very unique to their organization, that they sometimes can prevent themselves from seeing beneficial processes that other folks are using. Alrighty, so other ways to gain and share industry knowledge. We talked about already the Trailblazer community. Obviously, you all are attending a nonprofit community group meeting right now, so you're at least somewhat plugged into that. Also, just going into the general Trailblazer community that's now been merged all together with the Trailhead, and everything's all connected. Also, connecting with other nonprofits with a shared purpose is a great way to collaborate, ask questions, get feedback, exactly like Ruby's comment. And then also just following good quality nonprofit content. So whether this is finding a think tank or industry leaders that you respect and admire for their management and leadership process, but being able to just get into that mindset of thinking about the nonprofit structure, their language, their terminology. I said language a couple times, and I just want to take a moment to highlight that this is also a place where I think folks coming from more of a for-profit environment really struggle with nonprofits. I have a client that I've worked with recently who we had an additional partner that was installing their app and doing some configuration. And this partner usually works with for-profit workforce development. So things like placement agencies and hiring and staffing departments. And they had a really hard time just changing their language to reflect the language of what our client was using. So things like their staff are career coaches or career counselors, and the for-profit partner kept using, and I'm forgetting at the moment what the term was, but kept using this other term that was very businessy feeling and very kind of almost clinical feeling. And they have a great tool, they had a great implementation process, but my client just never felt 100% comfortable with them because they didn't feel like they were being heard, right? Even though the service was being delivered and the technology was being configured, there was a gap there that they could just never quite get over. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of shared language and really making that effort to hear and respect the terminology that the organizations use. All right, so I know at least one person I saw in the chat has already read Gordon's article. I'm going to drop this into the chat bar just in case you haven't. one of the things that I get a lot whenever folks reach out to me on social is, hey, how can I gain experience in Salesforce if like nobody's going to hire me because I don't have experience, but I can't get experience until someone hires me. And for far too long, the solution has always been, well, just go volunteer at a nonprofit. And I'm very glad to hear that the tide is finally, hopefully, turning on that piece of advice. And Gordon's article did a great job of illustrating why it's not the best advice and also providing some additional examples of ways that you can gain additional skills or experiences. So as people who are already connected to the nonprofit and Salesforce space, please feel free to share this article out. Whenever anybody reaches out to you and says, hey, can I get experience by volunteering with you? Say, no, thank you so much, but instead go try this. And I will get off my soapbox about that now. Okay, so we're going to talk a minute about some test taking tips. I don't know about y'all, tests are not my favorite thing. Just not something I get real excited about taking. And especially whenever you have to pay a couple $100s to sit down and take the test, also makes it a little bit less appealing. So I like to go into my tests feeling as prepared as possible. Now, if you've gotten maybe a couple of certification vouchers that you win doing different things, and you feel like, hey, I just want to give it a try without doing any studying and just see how it happens, good on you, knock yourself out, wish you the best of luck. But also being prepared for actually taking the test and developing some good test taking habits can help to make it a little bit less stressful. The first one is probably the most important, and it's practicing. Now, right now, as far as I know, there are not any nonprofit cloud consultant practice exams. So you may have seen things like Udemy or Focus on Force or Pluralsight, or a couple of training programs that have different resources that are available. And as far as I know, nobody's come out with an actual practice exam for the nonprofit cloud consultant yet. But when I say practice, what I mean is actually spinning up a developer org, installing NPSP into it, and then trying out the different things that are listed in the exam guide or in the trail mixes or the white papers or the articles. Just get in there and play around with it. Even the process of installing NPSP and following the post-install directions is going to be really helpful. If you go back to 18% of the exam guide is implementation strategies. So thinking about what are all the things that you need to think about when you're setting up NPSP for a new nonprofit client. You can also install it in as many orgs as you want. I mean, I personally have, I think, like 7 or 8 active dev orgs that I use for trying and practicing different things. It's a little bit nicer because right now you don't have like trailhead playgrounds. I was going to say playhead trailgrounds. That's not right. That you can really do a whole lot of this NPSP functionality in. So actually having that dev org and going in there and building things out can be a really great tool to get in there and practice. And for those of you who are already working in nonprofit environments, even if you have a sandbox at your org that you can play in, I'd still encourage you to have at least one dev org that you can go in and manipulate and play around and install free third-party apps and Salesforce Lab apps and all of those things to just get a little bit more experience on what exactly you can do. Ooh, and David's got a good tip in there for using Cumulus CI. Has anybody got any feedback or comments about using devorgs or installing NPSP in devorgs? All right. There's all the documentation for installing NPSP available on the Salesforce help.salesforce.com. I think everything's moved over there now. I mentioned the Trailblazer community yet again, and specifically what I'm mentioning here, it's not exactly like one-to-one connected to the Salesforce exam, but going into the Trailblazer community and looking at the kinds of questions that people are asking about NPSP, going in and seeing what kind of problems are people facing and either helping them to solve it or seeing what other folks are answering and then trying to solve it in your dev org. Obviously, there's some limitations to this, right? If they've got paid apps that are installed or things like that. But the Trailblazer community is one of my favorite places to refer people when they're looking to get hands-on experience, because one, you're actually getting to see real world problems that people are facing, not kind of sanitized, cleaned up versions. Two, you're also getting introduced to more people in the community. And so if you're looking at changing jobs or breaking into an industry, making those connections can be a really powerful tool to help you facilitate that transition. All right, now we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty about actual test taking skills. Read the whole question twice, at least, because so many of the Salesforce questions, they start off with a whole bunch of information that feels really important, but it's just kind of set up, or it's actually a little bit of a diversion. So read the whole question, stop and think about it, and then read it again and ask, what are they really asking for here? Because when they write those kind of tricky questions, it's a good chance that one of the multiple choice answers is the answer for the misleading part of the question, but it's not what they're actually asking for. I might be a little bit biased because I've taken some of the more advanced exams recently, and those ones were like super tricky, but I've seen this on every exam that I've taken. So you've got plenty of time to get through it. You don't have to rush through. Take the time to read it. If you're not in an in-person environment, like maybe kind of try to read it out loud a little bit, because if you're like me, your brain skips ahead whenever it's reading things. Read the whole thing twice and then see which of the answers, this is the next part that's tricky, is the best answer. And this comes up a lot on the consultant exams, where they will have 4 or 5 multiple choice questions. 2 of them technically do the thing that they're asking for, but one of them is the better way to do it. And the definition of better in this case is based on Salesforce best practice, which is usually covered in the trail mixes. Now, any questions on that so far? The wonderful, tricky, read the question, read it twice. Okay. If you're taking it in person, you will have the opportunity to have up to 3 sheets of paper and a pencil that you can sit down next to you at this computer at an in-person testing center. If you're taking it at home, nothing on your table, your counter, whatever it is you're working on, nothing. So if you are taking it in person, so I can't even remember who told me this, probably about 5 years ago, when you figure out how many answers you need to pass out of the 60 questions based on the pass fail rate, before you click start, before the timer starts on the little test, write down 1 through 60 on a piece of paper. And then as you're answering each question, if you know that answer 100%, circle it and move on. So if you're on question number 1 and you know without a doubt, I am 100% sure of the answer on this question, you circle the number 1 on your little field, click next, go to question number 2. If you're reading question number 2 and you have absolutely no idea, none whatsoever, answer it to the best you can, take your best guess. On your piece of paper, put an X next to number 2. So you know now, I don't need to go back and review question number 1, and I don't, because I absolutely know the answer, and I don't need to bother reviewing question number 2, because I could read that question 20 times and I'm still not going to have any idea. As you're going through each of these questions, keeping a tally of how many questions you are 100% sure of, and saying, okay, great. I'm getting close to that. I'm getting close to that percentage for passing. I'm feeling good and confident. And then the questions that you're like, oh, I feel like the answer is A, but I think B might also be a good question, a good answer. Put a question mark, or you can also use the little flag button on the test taking. Those are the only ones that you need to go back to. You don't need to go back to the ones you're sure of, and you don't need to go back to the ones that you have absolutely no idea about. So when you get to the end of the exam, anything that had a question mark, or if you're doing this at home that you've flagged as a review this question, those are the only ones you need to worry about. And there's a chance that one of the other questions that you've answered along the way might have something that connects to the questions that you weren't sure about. And we've got a question in the thread about how do those at-home tests work? Just need to take a big deep breath and let the stress out. I'm going to chime in, and then I want anyone else who's taken a Salesforce exam at home or virtually to also weigh in on their feedback. But the first part of it works exactly the same. You go to webassessor.com and you sign up and you schedule a date and time. So if you're going in person, you're picking your location and scheduling the date and time. Otherwise, you're saying remote and picking your date and time. You do have to set up biometrics. So you need to take a picture of your face, make sure that it's you. You do have to make sure that your computer has all of the right settings and programming and everything for their system to integrate with. You have to turn off your firewall and any, I think, pop-up blockers or something else, and they walk you through all of these things that you need to do. It used to be a lot harder in that you needed to have like 2 cameras. So you needed to have one facing you and then one like pointing down or showing your workspace to prove that there's no one else there. There's no one hiding under your table giving you the answers. And when you actually go in to take your exam, when you launch the testing system, it will monitor you. And so if there's, I don't know, if you're like me and you've got dogs and Amazon happens to deliver and there's a cacophony of barking, that might trigger a proctor to be like, hey, something might not be right. They're going to pause your exam wherever you are and then interrupt you in some way. The only time I've ever been interrupted, there was apparently such a high volume that the proctor never actually got back to me. I sat there for 20 minutes waiting for like, what's going on? Why can't I continue my exam? And then I finally closed out, opened a ticket. They reinstated and like scheduled it for an hour later and it was fine. Vanessa looks like she has used them before. So Vanessa, did you want to weigh in? Oh, sorry, you had a thing about reviewing the ones that you have no clue about. Okay, Charlie, did that answer your question about how the remote ones work? I think some of it's personal preference. I've got some friends who have literally never gone into an exam center to take an exam. I've got other friends who have like held off taking certification exams until they can get back to in-person centers. For myself, I really like the piece of paper. I'm a visual tactile person. And so when it's asking questions about like role hierarchies or something, like I want to be able to write out what they're describing in the scenario and draw a little picture and highlight things. It's just how my brain works, but everybody's a little bit different. So I'd actually encourage you to try it. Try a remote one if you've only done in person, try an in-person one if you've only done it remote. All right, there is one last resource that I want to share, and I saved it for last because I think it's the best. And I believe that this is also linked in John Richter's Trail Mix. So this is the Nonprofit Cloud Consultants Training and Certification Guide that was part of the partner community, but it should be generally available. It's not behind any like login walls or anything. One of the reasons that I love this is it has all of the subsections from the exam guide with a ton of resources. And I can promise you, I took the Nonprofit Cloud Consultant exam, I think December of 2018, somewhere back then. There 100%, I promise you, there were questions on the exam that I only knew the answer because I read one of these obscure articles that are linked here. And so take the time, read through each of the articles, complete the trailheads that are recommended here, watch the videos if there's videos that are linked. It's a fantastic resource that they've put together, and I literally cannot recommend it enough. And I promise I don't get any kickbacks for how many people click on this link, but it's just a really fantastic resource. All right, folks, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Well, actually, there was
Sorry,
one.
Skye, where
Yeah.
was that link in particular? It just went by a little quick.
Oh, in the chat, I put
Oh.
the partners link
Gotcha. Thank you.
Did you get it?
Yep.
Okay, great. Very last thing, feel free to connect with me on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm always happy to connect and collaborate with folks in the nonprofit Salesforce space. And I would love to hear whenever y'all pass your nonprofit cloud consultant certification exams.
Excellent. Thank you, Skye. That was really great. So for anybody here, I guess we'll just open it up. If you guys have any questions for Skye or just anything that is Salesforce related in general that you want to bring to the group, it's an open forum. So speak up. We got kind of a quiet.
I don't have a question, but this has been very helpful and a lot of good resources put out there. So definitely feel like I've got my homework before the next meeting.
Great. I'm glad that it was useful for you. Is anyone planning or scheduled to take the exam before the end of the year?
I'm planning.
I will say I have heard of my friends and colleagues that have taken it recently, that there's a heavy focus on, as far as the solution design piece, I think is the category it falls under, on marketing tools. So sort of understanding whether Marketing Cloud or Pardot would best accomplish a specific requirement. I don't know how much. So anytime people say like, oh my gosh, there's like a ton of questions about such and such on my exam, I also recognize that there's probably a question bank of like 300 questions, and the system has its logarithm about how to pull in X number of questions from each of the categories. So you may take the exam next month and there's like 2 questions about Marketing Cloud. And then Laura might take it the next month and there's like 8 questions. So, you know, full disclosure, what one person experiences may not be your case. But that was one in particular that I've heard from a couple of different people. So I feel like it's a pretty safe bet.
No questions for me, but like Charlie, thank you for your time in doing this.
My pleasure.
Skye, let me ask you a question. So it's been a long time since I took my last certification exam, like a long, long time ago. I remember when I took it, the majority of the learning was based off of like, you know, some sort of question banks, you know, that you found some questions, you know, floating around online and you tried to memorize as many of those as you could, along with, you know, there was that breakdown in like a chart, and then you could kind of try to research it yourself. This is even predates like Trailhead and things like that. So my question to you is, do you feel like nowadays you could just go through the trail mix and then after having gone through one of the trail mixes, be well prepared to go in and pass the test?
That's a great question, Joseph. I think that for like admin and platform app builder, absolutely. Because again, it's much more like, what is the right book answer for how to do a thing? I think with any of the consultant exams, doing just the trail mix is going to get you close, but is still going to be a little bit of a challenge because it's the hands-on piece, right? If both Process Builder and Flow can do a thing, okay, maybe this isn't the best example since they're retiring Process Builder or whatever, but like if both Process Builder and Flow can do the same thing, which one is the best? And really being able to have gone in and say, okay, I know I did this with Process Builder, but whenever I do it with Flow, like I ran into these issues, right? So that's where I think being able to actually go in and do things, go in and set up an opportunity path, go in and set up an automation or like, you know, an email alert or whatever. That's where I think the consultant exams, you do have to take it a little bit further than just going through the trail mix or just doing some practice exams. That being said, there are some practice exams that actually do provide really good documentation on like why an answer is right or wrong, which can help a little bit to bridge that gap. I definitely encourage you to stay away from like Quizlets, things where people can just like randomly post what they think the questions are. When I was studying for my first admin exam, somebody had recommended Quizlet to me, and I got maybe, I don't know, 20, 30 questions into someone's publicly posted Quizlet. And I was like, 5 of these answers are wrong. Like, I don't want to waste any time studying wrong answers. And after that, I've literally never touched Quizlet again. But the things that are, full disclosure, like additional paid products like Udemy and Pluralsight and Focus on Force, those tend to have like the research backing up that like, this is why this answer is right. But what I also love, particularly about Focus on Force, also, I don't get any kickbacks from them. I love that you can't just memorize the question. You actually have to understand why the scenario is and why this is the right answer. And so if you go into it thinking, oh, this is like a dump, and I'm just going to, a dump being a dump of the answers or the questions from the actual exam, not like a messy area. But thinking that this is an exam dump and I just need to memorize the answers, you're going to be sorely disappointed, because they're not going to be the same questions that are on the exam, but they're going to cover the same information. And it might even be that the question is sort of like reversed in Focus on Force. And the answer in Focus on Force is, to stick with my previous bad example, process builder, because blah, blah, blah. But then in the real exam, the answer is flow because of yada, yada, yada. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, if anybody reaches out to you requesting exam dumps after you post that you have successfully passed any exam, please report them to Salesforce.
Thank you, Skye.
Great. Well, if there aren't any other questions, thank you all so much for joining today. It's been great talking with y'all, and I wish you all the best of luck whenever you're ready to take your exam. And I hope that you have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thank you, Skye.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Take care.
You too.